Hey everybody, welcome to Dad's Den of Pop Culture. We're starting a new year, 2024, and I thought it might be fun to take a look at another new year. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. 1985. In particular, a copy of Amazing Heroes, which was a sort of a book about comics, a magazine about comics. You can see I have an actual physical copy here. Oh, look at that. And this was their preview issue for 1985. So they're going through all the titles that they're aware of that are coming out that year. And it's a lot of titles. If nothing else, it sort of puts the lie, number one, to the idea that all they produced back in the day were superhero comics, because we have, well, granted, I actually crunched all the numbers, about 44% were superheroes. You also have a lot of sci-fi, fantasy, just kind of action, adventure, but you also have comedy, and you have a lot of kids' books. There was a bigger variety than you might think. And it also, squashes a little bit the idea. Well, I won't say squashes, but it shows you just how many comic book companies were producing books at that time. Marvel and DC still dominated. Marvel, if you include their Epic line and their Star Comics, about 36% of the titles were coming from Marvel, and about 23% were coming from DC, but you have quite a few other publishers producing books at the time. But I think what was more interesting to me looking through this is that you're sort of seeing this preview in real time of the end of the Bronze Age of comics. Now, 1985 is often agreed upon as the year the Bronze Age ended and what they call the Modern Age began. I guess today we're probably in the postmodern age. And when you go through this preview, you can really see why they say that. Although I think arguably 1983 sort of started the process, as you had a lot of very, for lack of a better term, a lot of very 70s comics and characters sort of ending in that year. Son of Satan loses his powers and just becomes a normal human being again. You had books. I think Tomb of Dracula was canceled that year. I think Werewolf by Night was canceled that year. I think Shang-Chi was canceled that year. Power Man and Iron Fist kept going. But you saw these changes already starting to happen. And so this preview, I think you see kind of where things were starting to go. So I thought it might be fun to go through kind of page by page. And we're going to be flipping through some of these pages very quickly because, like I said, there are a lot of titles. But we'll linger on a few in particular as we go through. So let's take a look. What comic series were coming out in 1985, or at least were planned to come out in 1985? Sometimes those plans didn't always come to fruition. So right off the bat, we get A Distant Soil. We get Action Comics. We get Alan Moore's comic. And I'm not exactly sure what Alan Moore's comic was. I hunted around just a little bit. I didn't see anything that was obvious or ground shaking. Cool image, though, for Nova Woman there with Action Comics. And A Distant Soil would go on for quite a while, actually. A lot of the indie books, or maybe we'll call them small press books or creator-owned books, they had much longer lives than you might think. Now, Alien Legion was a book that I got into in the mid-'80s. I mean, in fact, I think 85 is close to the point that I started collecting comics. Might have been more like 86. I think it was, actually, because I noticed most of the Marvel books at this point were still going for 65 cents. I'm talking about the monthlies. DC was already up to 75. Marvel was mostly at 65, a few 75 centers in there. When I started collecting my memory is that like everything was 75 cents, the monthly floppy types. So I think I got into it the year after. But Alien Legion's one of the books that I got into. It was a very cool book. It was nice. It didn't fit into a continuity. It had a lot of room to explore. That was a very interesting book. That's one that I wouldn't mind picking a few copies of. All-Star Squadron, interesting book. I've read a few. I didn't love it as much as I thought I would. And they mention here in the preview they're going to try to be whittling it down to fewer characters so they could focus on them a little bit more. It often seemed like it was a little bit hurried rush. There was too much there. And the context of it being set in World War II, I think, had some issues as well. Of course, things are going to be changing for the All-Star Squadron in the very near future. Alpha Flight, one of the first books I ever collected. As if you saw the video from a couple days ago, I'm going through all of my Alpha Flights, doing sort of a read-through that I'm going to post once a week, at least for the John Byrne initial run, and then I'll probably hit the others. Obviously, Byrne was off the title, I think, right around here is when they were making the switch to the new creative team, which, if memory serves, was Bill Mantlo and Mike Mignola. And that's kind of what I first got into. And I didn't know what it was. I just saw it sitting there on the shelf, and the cover of the issue I got into, it had like box on it, so it was like a robot and cool stuff. And I don't know, I was in. So I've been an Alpha Flight fan for a long time, a big time. Amazing High Adventure, Amazing Spider-Man, obviously, Ambush Bug, American Flag. That was one I never quite got into. Some of the comics were starting to go a lot more adult at this point. Not all of them. The mainstream wasn't quite there, but the smaller press books were going more grown up, grim, gritty, violent, explicit, and they were starting to really get some traction. And that's one of those places where you could see the Bronze Age comics for kids is starting to end here, and the modern age of comics primarily for adults is starting to begin. Amethyst, the Jim World, those always look cool to me, but I've never read any of them. Aquaman obviously was going through some big changes at this point. He'd been with the Justice League of America when it went into kind of its first transition away from Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, call him the Super Friend, so to speak. Aquaman was the leader of this new league with some new characters. He ends up leaving. I think they were probably doing some work for his own book. And that's where Martian Manhunter becomes the leader. And then when they ended Justice League of America, began Justice League International. John Jones is still in charge. Arion of Atlantis, that's another one that's more in the fantasy, but it's still DC continuity. Then you get like Armor and Silver Streak, and that was when Neil Adams continuity. I think he was doing work like this for another publisher, and they went belly up, and he started producing the work himself with Continuity Associates. I had a few of those. Those were kind of brand new. It's weird. It's almost as soon as I got into comics, I was starting to edge more towards some of the smaller press stuff. I think it was partly because it's a little intimidating when you're looking at like a comic book and it's number 453 or number, 200 or 300 something. And you realize there's this long run that you've missed, and you're not reasonably ever going to be able to buy those and catch up on them. But when you see some of these smaller titles that are number 1, number 2, number 3, whatever, you feel like you're kind of getting in on the ground floor. I've always been into that. Cutie Bunny was sort of like, early on in the furry trend, I guess you could say. Takes all sorts to make a world. Atari Force, well known as being Aaron Lopresti's least favorite comic title ever. I've never read Atari Force. I don't know. Avengers, this is about when I was getting into Avengers, because I remember getting into it, and Monica Rambeau, Captain Marvel, was the leader at that point. And so they were going to lose a couple of these team members. But I got into it when Buscema was drawing it. Yeah, that was good. Aztec Ace. The Badger, I just recently started getting some issues of the Badger, and I really liked him. It was not at all what I was expecting. That was a crazy comic book. A lot of interesting stuff there. Batman and the Outsiders. He wouldn't be with the Outsiders much longer. Here, though, we come to one of the, four horsemen of the Bronze Age apocalypse. Batman Special Project. Just a special project. No big deal. Well, that special project was being written by Frank Miller. And drawn by Frank Miller. And obviously, that special project was Batman: The Dark Knight Returns. This is the copy I had back in the day. I think it was like a second or maybe third printing. And man, was I into this book at that time. I was in high school, so it just really printed in Canada. So it seemed so grown up to me. I really thought it was cool, and I have to admit that as I've gotten older, my sense of what adult and grown up has changed quite a bit. And The Dark Knight Returns is no longer what I look at as being particularly grown up. I think that I'm not entirely happy with the impact it had on the Batman character and on comic books in general, but it undeniably had a massive impact and really shifted things, or hastened that shift that was kind of happening, of taking the sort of darker small press indie stuff into the mainstream. And you were getting that with Marvel with their Epic line, and it seems like DC was even maybe more ahead of the curve on that than Marvel was. So, Best of DC Digest, Bizarre Adventures, which is one I never really heard of. Black Diamond, I do remember the Americomics books, which were a lot of good girl art, as they called it back in the day. And it was, at some point, it seems like that basically superheroines as pinups kind of came to dominate the entire comic book space, which is probably why at a certain point you were getting some blowback from people who weren't real happy with that. When people kind of reminisce about the old days and we used to have this, that, and the other, which is all awesome. But, when things start to kind of go to one extreme, there will tend to be a bounce back at a certain point. And I think we're going through that now, unfortunately. But you kind of got that with Americomics. That was kind of the preview for very buxom heroines without a lot of costume on. They're teasing Black Panther. I think that was a mini series at that point. Blue Devil's one that I never really got into, but I wouldn't mind reading. Captain Quick and a Foozle. I mean, you see that there's the Boz Chronicles. There's a lot of really interesting stuff coming out at this point. When I was going through it, I was making a list of things to start looking for, like on eBay and all that, and that were affordable enough to be able to dip into and read and experience. Captain Carrot, the Oz Wonderland War. Again, that's sort of your funny animal stuff mixed in with superheroes. Captain Paragon, Captain Phil's Galactic Space Palace. There's Cerberus, the Aardvark, another huge indie title that was really, it was getting the attention of a lot of people in the comic book world, and again was starting to I think, push the mainstream more adult, more dark, because of the critical acclaim for those books. Even though they weren't outselling the top stuff, they were making a big enough impact that Marvel and DC were paying attention. And again, that's part of what goes into, the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the modern age. Cloak and Dagger. I love Cloak and Dagger. That was another early one that I started collecting. I'm trying to get as many of them back as I can at this point. That was a really interesting book. Conan the Barbarian, of course, a perennial at that point. I primarily got Savage Sword. So here we come to, once again, one of the big events that was going to change comic books forever. Crisis on Infinite Earths. And it's an impact for a couple different reasons. Marvel had done Secret Wars the year before. So you have this sort of, big crossover event of characters. And it was very successful. I got to admit, though, I finally got to read the whole thing, and I really wasn't that impressed with it. There were some cool things that came out of it, primarily Spider-Man with the alien suit, which at a certain point would be like, oh God, I've had enough of Venom. But it was a big deal. And so DC then comes in with Crisis on Infinite Earths, which I would say was a better crossover event and a much more impactful one. Again, I'm not in love with how it changed the DC universe. I kind of like the Earth 1, Earth 2 thing with the old heroes and the new heroes. Would have been almost kind of fun if at a certain point when they wanted to relaunch, say in the early 2000s, if they'd still had that old scheme. Would have been kind of cool if you had an Earth 3 with new modern versions of the characters who could then interact with the sort of Silver Bronze Age characters on Earth 2, or was that Earth 1? I'm trying to remember now. And the 1940s, 50s characters on Earth 2. And you could then advance them a little bit older. You could have now the Bronze Age characters being more, middle-aged and, early senior citizenhood. And a whole new crop of these characters on your third Earth. Would have been an interesting way to revitalize your characters without throwing the old stuff out, or without having to completely destroy, your canon and what you had before. But, they did what they did, but it was hugely impactful. And among other things, I think cemented the idea of major crossover series for the comic book companies. Because as you would go, you'd get like DC's Alien Invasion. You had Marvel like Atlantis Attacks and I think Evolutionary Wars and things like that. Which again, good for sales. I think sometimes bad for story, because it often forced a comic that it was crossing over with to sort of drop what the author was doing with the book so he could sort of shoehorn in some crossover thing. And sometimes even forced them to, alter, kill off a minor character who was, important to the story as a whole to make the whole thing seem more impactful. Some of the stuff with the Manhunters in DC did that. And it was always kind of like, the crossover is a one-time thing. I don't think it should have maybe that big of an impact on individual books, especially if they got a good storyline going already. If you want to use it to boost the sales of some books that are lagging, maybe it's okay then. But that was a huge deal. And that's so you got Dark Knight Returns, Crisis on Infinite Earths, two nails in the coffins nails in the coffin of the Bronze Age. Crossfire, Dakota North. That's one that always interested me. It was a little more adult, kind of crime mystery. Never got to read them. Kind of always wanted to. Daredevil was going through some changes. Daredevil Special Projects, which, if memory serves, were, let's see. off. I left my bifocals at work. Um, Frank Miller is working on 2 Daredevil-related graphic novels for 1985. One is an Elektra story dealing with Daredevil's former lover and adversary, in which Daredevil appears only as Matt Murdock, which Miller will write, draw, and ink. It will be colored by Lynn Varley and edited by Al Milgrom. The second is a Daredevil story that was originally intended to run in issues 219 and 220 of the regular comic series, but will now also be published as a graphic novel. The story, written by Miller and edited by Ralph Macchio, will be penciled and inked by Bill. Okay, see, my whole childhood it was Sienkiewicz, and it's Sienkiewicz, I think. And I apologize. It's so hard once you learn to completely mispronounce a name from reading it to suddenly switch to the correct pronunciation. It revolves the storyline of the relationship between Daredevil's nemesis, the Kingpin, and his wife, Vanessa, who was left mentally incapacitated by events that nearly killed her in the Daredevil stories that Miller previously did. So, again, Daredevil, and we have Frank Miller in there. Daredevil starts to become more of a grown-up comic book as well. We have the Dazzler series, which I have just started reading. I finally have enough that I feel like I can get a sense of the series. I don't like to a lot of times I like to get, maybe 10 to 12 issues of something that I haven't read before. Even if they're not a full run, so I can just sort of pick up on the vibe of a character, and I've just started doing that, and I'm enjoying it. It's a good story. DC Challenge, DC Comics presents the Defenders was going through a big change here to the new Defenders, which I really wanted to like, and I gotta be honest with you, I wasn't in love with. I just couldn't stand Moondragon. I could not get rid of that character quickly enough. Beast seems like he's just moping and whining all the time, which kind of it's not the character that you kind of want. You understand it for a moment as they kind of deal with some life changes, but you kind of like him to get back to the fun beast that he was. There was a lot of promise there. Setting it in New Mexico. I mean, you got like New Mexico and the whole American Southwest is such a center of weirdness. UFOs and missing people, and you're nearby where you get a lot of the Bigfoot stuff, and of course in Marvel Comics you're near where the Hulk was created, and I don't know, it didn't feel like it felt like there's so much more you could have done with it. For me, and then Cloud, I was just not interested in Cloud, and that took up a lot of time. I think the character I liked the most was Gargoyle. I thought he was pretty cool. Detective Comics, the Ditko Collection, DNA Agents, Doctor Strange, Doctor Who, Domino Chance. We got Dreadstar. We got E-Man. I think E-Man was making a comeback at that point. The Elementals, which is cool. I finally got to read some Elementals. I'd read Justice Machine back in the day. I hadn't read Elementals, and I hadn't realized that it was a Bill Willingham book. And having kind of grown up on classic D&D, I knew Willingham from his art in some of the TSR stuff. And it was kind of like, whoa, he did comics? And that's how out of the loop I was as far as that goes. So I've gotten to read a few, and I like them. I'd like to read more of those. Elfquest was like huge. Yeah, that was big. I can even remember some role-playing game supplements for Elfquest. The Eternals was getting a mini-series. The Ewoks, and this is where the Marvel Star Comics, I think we're maybe launching that year. Because all of the descriptions I read of them was sort of like, in this new series. So I think this might have been the first year for Star Comics. There's a ton of that stuff. Fantastic Four. There's FemForce, again, from Americomics. The kind of pinup art. There's the Firestar Limited series, which I'm missing one issue of, and I'm trying to get that before I read it. But kind of cool, crossing over from the cartoon into the Marvel Universe. Flaming Carrot, there's another critical darling of the time. So Flash, you notice such a short description of Flash, and it's like, well, because some things were going to be changing for the Flash. Pretty severe changes due to the Crisis on Infinite Earths. Indiana Jones, Fury of Firestorm, and it is kind of interesting reading a lot of the DC descriptions, because you're now going, you knew that a lot was changing. GI Combat, one of the first comics I ever got when I was a kid, and always liked them. It was kind of cool. It was still going around in '85. I don't think for much longer though. Gargoyle, that I just mentioned, was getting a miniseries. G.I. Joe, of course, was going really strong at that point. Green Lantern. I'm not sure if they were into the Green Lantern Corps at that point. It might have been just before that. I remember collecting Green Lantern Corps and really digging it. Kilowog, etc. Yeah, so they're talking about Hal Jordan sort of stepping aside a bit, and John Stewart stepping up. So I think that that was the point where they're on the cusp of going Green Lantern Corps. I liked that book a lot. I think it was fun, all the different characters and seeing how they interacted with each other, kind of making it a team book. It's kind of weird having them all on Earth, but well, what have you. Grimjack for more of your indie, kind of more mature stuff. Gru the Wanderer. Okay, Hawkeye and the West Coast Avengers. West Coast Avengers was a big book for me when I was starting out. I collected a lot of those. And you could see that it hadn't quite gelled yet. It was Hawkeye and the West Coast Avengers at that point. I think coming from the Hawkeye miniseries. But yeah, I loved. In fact, I don't know. I might have been collecting that before I started on the regular Avengers. I can't remember. Hawkman, Heartthrobs, Every Woman's Fantasy of Love. Obviously, I have all those. Heathcliff, Hero, Hugo, Incredible Hulk. Infinity Incorporated, cool book. That was going to survive Crisis. And actually, in some ways, made more sense at that point. Iron Man. I'm trying to think what was going on in Iron Man for that year. What do we have for Iron Man? Oh, Denny O'Neil. See if I can do this without destroying the comic book. Oh yeah, this is when Stark and Rhodes were both Iron Man, and Stark had lost control of his company and had started a new one called Circuits Maximus. Great name. Jim, Son of Saturn, always seemed like it was Martian Manhunter, only red and from a different planet. John Sable, Freelance. That's another cool book I'd like to get into. Jonah Hex was still kicking. Journey, you see some of the impact of European comics here as well. Judge Dredd, that's a big one. Justice League of America came to such a sad end. I gotta say, I didn't love the way that series ultimately ended. I thought it had some real potential with some of the new characters, and it just kind of went a sad way. Wanted information on out-of-print comics. Companies, Dell, Lev Gleason, etc. Call David Petty or Petty or Piatti. Concord, well, not call him, but mail him. You wonder if he still lives there. Probably not. This is a pretty long time ago. Cole, Last American. Legion of Superheroes. That's one I got into after a while. And I kind of dug that. So they're, pitching a new Lois Lane series at this point. That's going to be more on her being a top, reporter rather than somebody that Superman saves. So somewhat different from Superman's girlfriend, Lois Lane. Longshot was kind of new at that point. There's Love and Rockets, you see obviously on the cover of this thing. I'll be honest, Love and Rockets always intimidated me when I was a kid. I was always kind of like, I don't think I'm going to get this. I think this comic is too smart for me. And I didn't read them. I probably should go back and get some. Maybe there's some collections. Macross is there. Mage. Mantech Robot Warriors. So here we get a double page spread advertisement for the Crisis on Infinite Earths. I wanted to include that because some pretty awesome George Perez art and a pretty important series. So we got Marauder the She-Wolf, Marvel Fanfare. Marvel Fanfare was a great book. I got a few of those. I really enjoyed them. Marvel Man, that's your deconstruction stuff. Not a fan, but it had a big impact on the modern age of comics. There's no doubt about that. Amazing Man, the comedy stuff was still there. Mechanics. Megaton Man, I believe, was also comedy. Oh, Moonlight. There's a new Moonlight series, I think. Or maybe that was continued. Might have been a continued one. Mr. Monster is one that's always been interesting to me. Ms. Tree was interesting. Ms. Mystic, I had a few of those from way back. And I always thought that was a really cool comic. But God, I hardly remember it at this point. New Mutants was, I think, at that point. I think Sienkiewicz was working that one already. And that's, I remember, that was when I started collecting it. And I remember that was another early one where you're like, this art's really weird. I don't know if I like it. I mean, when you're like, 14 to 16 years old and you're kind of exploring, it's kind of fun. You see these things, they're new, they're different. Am I going to like them? Am I not going to like them? But I think that was a really important moment for comics. To introduce an art style that was so different from any kind of house style that you would have had at Marvel or DC. There's always been artists with their own styles, but he was so different. I think that was showing that they were growing up quite a bit. New Teen Titans, of course, big book at the time, and a great book at the time. There's Nexus, so Nexus is rolling at that point. Nick Fury versus S.H.I.E.L.D., I remember that was kind of a big deal. The Nightcrawler miniseries, official handbook of the Marvel Universe. Now, I don't know if this is the first one they did or if this is when they sort of brought it back in the deluxe edition. Yeah, this is the revised and expanded version. And you're going to see later Who's Who in the DC Universe is also going on. That's my DC and Marvel universes right there. That's the ones I came into. Those are the ones that I think about when I think about these characters and these companies. And I have to admit, as the books changed and got further away from those, is when I was kind of like, don't really like these things. Omaha the Cat Dancer, speaking of furries and adult comics. Omega Men, the PIs. We got Peter Parker, Spectacular Spider-Man. Peter Porker, Spectacular Spider-Ham. Power Man and Iron Fist, like I said, still going in 85. Power Pack is an interesting one. And there's a comic lot on, I think, Goodwill. The first 22 issues, I'm like, if that doesn't get a big bid, I might go for that. Louise Simonson, and I'd like to check it out a little bit more. I remember at the time, again, 14 to 16 years old, like, I don't want a book about little kids. That's lame, But man, they had some pretty big crossovers. And I think I really would like to read that book about little kids now. Punisher, Red Sonja, Red Tornado. I think they were trying again with that poor character. Rocket Raccoon. So here we go again. Not necessarily a comic that changed the industry, but has a big impact to this day. I mean, I can remember when that was a really sort of niche little series. I think I had a few of them. I don't anymore. I had a few. I don't think I ever had the complete series, but when you first look at it, you're like going, oh, it's kind of like it's like Spider-Ham. It's a it's an animal hero. It's gonna be cute and funny, and it was not cute and funny. But yeah, there's one that had a big impact. Rocketeer, irregular publishing, but I mean, Stevens was like, he was doing stuff that nobody was doing. He just was. It was absolutely beautiful art, and if you have not seen the documentary about his life, I know it's on Tubi at the moment. It probably is elsewhere. Drawn to Perfection. Watch it. It'll probably get you a little misty at the end. Great little documentary. Such an extraordinary guy. Rom was still going at that point. There's Savage Sword of Conan. I didn't miss those if I could avoid it. Secret Origins, cool book. Secret Wars 2. Yeah, Secret Wars did well. So how about the sequel? Was not into that sequel. Yeah, like I was saying earlier, I'm not a real big fan of the big crossover events. Sergeant Rock, still kicking. She-Hulk, I believe, is a tease for John Byrne's She-Hulk, which I think this is what became Sensational She-Hulk. I don't think that came out quite yet. That seems like, again, because when 85, I was in junior high. Or, yeah, I was still at junior high. And I think I was buying Sensational She-Hulk when I was in high school. So I think that might have gotten paused. Interesting though, it's this will contain elements that will set up the Shield limited series and will involve a major, I kid you not, development for Shield. Possibly, but not definitely yet. There will be a new name for She-Hulk. She wouldn't be She-Hulk anymore. She'd be something else. The series will introduce Cockroach, the most disgusting villain I've ever created. He's kind of a human cockroach. Well, thank you, John. That was well said. So it's not just a clever name. Now I'm wondering if that didn't turn into a graphic novel. It's been too long. I think I still have the graphic novel. Silver Surfer, Sisterhood of Steel. Southern Knights was one I always wanted to get into. I always thought that was a cool concept. Oh, the Spirit. They were doing those Spirit reprints. I had a few of those. Yeah, I really got into that. And reading those got me more into a lot of older comic work. I remember at the library there were some collections. Dick Tracy, Buck Rogers. Dick Tracy I really liked. I really got into that. And it wasn't too many more years before Warren Beatty did that movie. But also Pogo. Yeah, so Eisner got me into looking at more of the classic illustrators from comic books. Squadron Supreme, I have that miniseries. And I'm torn on it. And I think I'm gonna review it at some point. It had a lot going for it, but I think there was some. I think the problem is it tried to cram way too much into 12 issues. And so some of it felt like it was moving too fast. Things were happening too fast. Yeah, that's one that I wanted to like a lot more than I did like. But it still sort of stays with me. There's elements of it I like quite a bit. But it kind of has like a Hamlet ending to it. Star Trek, I got to admit, I've never been into. I love the original series. But the books and the comic books never feel like they get Star Trek right. They frankly don't, in my opinion. They don't really get it right. It lacks the heart and soul of the series. Star Wars, though. Star Wars is still happening. And they were going to run into enemies from another galaxy, even further away potentially. And that was an image of one of them. Let's see if they had the name. Yeah, Lumia, a new Star Wars villainess designed by Cynthia Martin. It's amazing how far that, because at this point we're 2 years past Return of the Jedi. You had like the Ewoks and Droids cartoons going, but comic book was still going strong. And obviously with the Empire more or less destroyed, Darth Vader destroyed, etc. I'll never accept that Boba Fett was destroyed. There's just no way. He could have flown out of the Sarlacc. Come on. But yeah, they were still printing that one. So you see, we're at the end of the Bronze Age, but there's things that are still carrying through. Star Slayer with some gorgeous little preview of the art there. Let's see, Steel Script Starkey. Oh, Steve Canyon Magazine. Dude, I won an auction with 22 issues of that for a obscenely low price. I really didn't think I was going to win it. So I'm going to be trying to read and review some of those in this year. I'm really kind of excited about that. Yeah, that was an amazing auction. Superman. These are very transitional for Superman. John Byrne's going to be in there before you know it, and you can kind of tell they're not. They obviously don't want people to know what is exactly going to happen in Crisis, so they're keeping the cards close to their chest. And you can kind of tell in some of the descriptions of like Action Comics and Superman that it's sort of, well, we're going to do some shorter stories, like 2 or 3 shorter stories in every issue. Yeah, because it's like, we need filler. We need filler for about a year until we can relaunch this book. Swamp Thing, still going strong. Sword of Solomon Kane, which I'm going, did that happen? I'm not sure if that happened or not. If it did, I really want it. Tales of It's a Potato. I guess. Tales of Legion Superheroes. Tales of the Thunder Agents. Tales of the Teen Titans. There's a lot of Tales books. Palace of the Wilderness Sea. Oh. So again, another horseman of the end of the Bronze Age. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Heroes on the Half Shell. I think at that point we're pre-cartoon. I don't think they'd gotten to the cartoon yet. Yeah, here we go. Eastman and Laird's idiosyncratic humor adventure book, which took off as a parody of Frank Miller's work and kept on going, will see a second issue released in January, with more to come later in the year. The second issue will follow the 4 intrepid Terrapin warriors, Leonardo, Donatello, Michelangelo, and Raphael, and their mentor Splinter as they make their first human friend and battle hordes of nasty little robots. There will be plenty of action and some laughs too, promise the creators. The issue will also feature a pinup of the Turtles inked by Brad Foster and a full wraparound cover. We hope to continue this pinup page in future issues, said Eastman and Laird. I wonder if they both said it like simultaneously, like weird twins talking. So that's interesting. That's like the dawn of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which is an adult kind of parody, satire type comic book, which then becomes the biggest children's property of the late 80s. Like, without a doubt. If there was anything coming, a wave coming to destroy, Star Wars figures and He-Man and all that good stuff, it was the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Man, did they come on strong. The Thing, maybe my favorite Marvel character. The Thing comic book. Again, another one I'm torn on. The whole post-Secret Wars on that battle planet. I couldn't wait for it to end. I got what they were doing, but I think they could have accomplished it in 2 or 3 issues. I liked it much better when it was the Thing, back on Earth, kind of wandering America. I wish they leaned more into that. He hooks up with Team America, the motorcycles, and then gets into the unlimited class wrestling. That stuff I enjoyed. We got Thor. Simonson is working on it. At that point, that's one of the runs I'm trying to complete. Friggin' love Simonson Thor, and my love of Simonson Thor is why I did not love the Thor movies that they put out, because it could have been a lot better if they'd stuck a lot closer to what he did. And so we're rounding it out. We got V. Immediately when I saw V, I'm like, V for Vendetta. No. This is V, the Visitors, the sci-fi, the eating the mouse. Yeah, that was big, and it never quite caught on quite the way it should. But everybody who witnessed V as a kid, that episode, will remember it for the rest of their lives. That was huge. Vigilante's a book I'd love to get into. Vision and Scarlet Witch. I think that was like a maxi series they were doing. Thunder Agents, Warlord, cool comic. Warrior. And here we go for maybe the last of the horsemen of the Bronze Age apocalypse. The Watchmen. The Watchmen. Huge. Deconstruction of superheroes. It was here, and it was going to keep on going whether I liked it or not. And it's still going whether I like it or not. I think you've deconstructed them enough. I think it's time now to actually construct some superheroes. But again, undeniably huge impact that ushers in the modern age of comics. Absolutely enormous. Web of Spider-Man, What If? I think they were still trying to figure out what they wanted to do with that. Here we get Who's Who, the definitive history of the DC Universe. Will Eisner's Quarterly. Dog Boy, fan's best friend. Nice. Wonder Woman, another one. They're going to be relaunching it. So here it's kind of, we don't know what we're doing. World's Finest, we don't know what we're doing. X-Men, which was just top of its game at that time. And here we have a little preview of the new Kitty Pryde, Shadowcat. Loved that costume. Very cool. Little Art Adams artwork for you. And we round it out with a few more. And I like how they got 2000 AD monthly at the end. But I believe alphabetically it should have been at the beginning. And so we have the 1985 preview issue. And we really see the change in comics that was happening, that was going on. They're becoming more mature, more adult. And we can see it specifically in Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns. And we can see Crisis on Infinite Earths heralding in mega crossovers in comic books, which are going to, look, if you love them, you love them, and you had a great time. And if you didn't love them, you were going to have to tolerate them for the next quite a few years. I think in the end, they kind of turned into a way to sell some comic books without actually providing better storytelling. Well, I got to get all the comics that touch on the crossover, so I'll buy them all. But we do see that the writing was on the wall here. And the good old days of kids' comics, of self-contained monthly stories wasn't over, but it was definitely beginning to wane. And as we proceeded from this point, we're going to start getting the comics on the nicer paper that are in the better, that are going to be more expensive. And that whole thing is starting to roll in 1985. 39 freaking years ago. So that does it for Dad's Den of Pop Culture today. A look at the beginning of the end of the Bronze Age of comics and the 1985 preview issue. Amazing Heroes was a very cool magazine. You can find them out there. And I'll tell you what, this one is primarily made up of just this preview, but typically a lot of interviews with creators. And this is some of that information is probably kind of lost to the ages at this point. You find them, and if you find them at a good price, I would say buy one. You might find some really cool information in there that has kind of been swept under the rug or lost in the shuffle over the years. It's a great little magazine. I'm trying to remember. I think I think that was the magazine that did the swimsuit special every year. So you kind of got, comic artists working with their, characters that often they created or that they were working on at the moment for the big two, putting their characters in swimsuits. Sometimes they were kind of sexy pinups. Sometimes they were just more, comedy for laughs. But I seem to remember those. I think that was Amazing Heroes. Go seek them out. They're great books, and they are sort of a living history of the comic book medium. Hey, if you enjoyed this little look at the 85 preview, and you enjoy, comic book videos, I try to do quite a few of them in Dad's Cinepop Culture, maybe give it a like, maybe think about subscribing or sharing with a friend. In the meantime, God bless everybody. Try to be kind to one another and have a little bit of fun out there. And I will see you next time in Dad's Den of Pop Culture. Bye-bye.